Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists Eating and Drinking with Acknowledged Risks 3 Years On webinar. I'm Judith Broll. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and a speech and language therapist by background, and I'm delighted to be sharing this webinar. I'm also really enjoying the rain forecast coming through the chat as well, so it feels like we really are a very UK-wide organisation here. Before we get going, there are a couple of housekeeping points we would like to remind you of. If I could have the next slide, please. Justina, who is labelled as RCSLT host, is on hand to help with any technical queries you might be having, as well as her colleague Hannah. So please use the chat button if you would like to get in touch with either of them if you've got any problems. We'd really appreciate it if you could send in any additional questions to our speakers using the Q&A button, and we will be reviewing those questions behind the scenes. Thank you to everybody in advance who sent their questions in the pre-registration for this webinar, which we have reviewed and we have themed. We are planning on asking our presenters to speak to these in the first instance, and we are reviewing your live questions as they come in. In this way, we hope that most of your questions will be covered. My colleague Kathleen Graham is also on this call, and with her, we will be monitoring your questions as they come in. And I thank her for all her behind-the-scenes support in this webinar. However, if your question is not addressed today, we will be producing an FAQ document following this event, which will be shared on the event pages of the website. So anything we can't answer this evening, you will be able to find there in the future. We're really mindful that this is a complex and evolving issue. From the pre-event questions, we noted there are certain themes that we will not be able to address in this webinar, but which we have noted, and we will continue to consider for future work streams. So that you can really concentrate on the content of this webinar, we wanted to confirm what we would not be covering in as much detail as perhaps we would like if we had 2 webinars. The first of these is the speech and language therapist's role with mental capacity assessments. RCSLT has information about this, which Justina, I hope, will be putting in the chat shortly. And if you have any further questions or would like to interact more with that, please contact our colleague Claire Moser. Again, her contacts should be in the chat shortly. We're also not able at the moment to cover EDAR and paediatrics in much detail. We are aware that this is an issue of great importance, and we will be reviewing this potential addition in any future document review over the next couple of years. Due to the national lens of all the work that RCSLT delivers, it's also not possible to deliver national templates for EDAR delivery locally. But we would really welcome any offers of any templates you're using so that we can share them on our EDAR resources webpage, so that we can inform local documentation and support colleagues in other places. If you have any of these documents, please contact Kathleen Graham. Again, her email will be coming up in the chat. In addition, due to the differing legislation in each nation, please be aware of your local variations. Again, in future reviews of this document, we may consider whether we would look at each nation's legal variations in more detail. Equally, we're not able to cover specific clinical conditions, so please consider this a webinar really looking at the guiding principles of EDAR. As ever, we want this event to be a safe and inclusive space for everyone, so please be respectful of all delegates' views and show compassion. As there be questions already about this, absolutely this event will be and is recorded and will be made available on the RCSLT website and our YouTube channel. We will also share the presentation slides in the future. So, having set the scene, I'm delighted to hand over to Steve Jameson, CEO of RCSLT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, and good evening to everybody from a very wet Wimbledon. It's really good to see the various weather forecasts from around the 4 nations. But yeah, where I am in Wimbledon, it's raining quite heavy now. As Judith said, I'm the Chief Executive at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you all to such a really important event this evening. Thank you all so much for your time out of your busy schedules to attend this evening's webinar discussing eating and drinking with acknowledged risks. Eating and drinking with acknowledged risks can sometimes be a difficult area to navigate, and we welcome the variety of professionals who are here today who recognise the importance of making this person-centred decision with a multidisciplinary team, and that is supported by legal services when complex situations arise. My personal work with dementia charities and in palliative care has highlighted the importance of supporting service users and professionals to make informed decisions about their care. Eating and drinking is a core part of our identities, and we shoulder a great responsibility in delivering quality services that respect the rights of all the individuals involved. So tonight, we welcome Darani Hasji, Senior Lecturer and Programme Lead for Speech and Language Therapy at the University of Greenwich and National Advisor for Dysphagia. Darani was the lead author on the working group who produced the RCSLT guidance on this topic. We're also really pleased to welcome Alex Rock-Keane, KC, a barrister, writer and educator specialising in mental capacity law, who sat on this working group and is an expert in consent and capacity law. I'd really like to thank Darani and Alex for giving up their time tonight to support us in learning more about this topic. With the knowledge you gain from tonight's webinar, I hope that you will feel more confident in working with service users and carers within this area and will continue the discussion in your workplaces. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Darani to start this evening's discussions. Welcome, Darani.
Thank you so much, Steve. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for making the time to join in the discussion. Having done a few of the in-person presentations of late, I do miss the engagement, networking and chit-chats that in-person platforms bring. But how fantastic to see so many of you being able to join in online today. So 3 years on from developing the guidance, and where are we at? Can I have the next slide, please? What we all, no doubt, will have sitting with us this evening are individuals and scenarios which have challenged us to look critically at the aspect of eating and drinking with acknowledged risks, and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists guidance around shared decision-making in adults. So Alex will be discussing the case of JJ in detail, whilst I will discuss some of the developments in the area and set the scene for how the guidance might assist in navigating the myriad of clinical intricacies that we come across in our respective environments. Next slide. When compiling this guidance, what permeated from the feedback was the hope for a quick fix, the one simple, all singing, all dancing document or flowchart that would miraculously erase the dilemmas and the deliberations that we find with decision making. Well, few things are ever this way, particularly when we are balancing individuals' choices, preferences, constantly changing knowledge, and the complexities of healthcare against ethical scenarios. Each person and their presentation deserves the respect to be considered independently. Whilst ethical frameworks provide, as David Kay says, a critical eye for when working through clinical examples, it is not a replacement for human rights. Next slide. So although we have a responsibility to ensuring health and survival, humanness galvanizes care from a medical model to person-centeredness. Professor Cathard, in her keynote address at the RCSLT conference in 2022, discussed inclusive care as a shift from case histories to life histories, where the angle is on the individual rather than pathologies. We treat the person, not the condition. And as Atul Gawande, a physician and author who wrote the book Being Mortal, iterates, we enable well-being, and well-being is about the reasons one wishes to be alive. Next slide, please. So let that percolate as you look through some of the quotes from service users on their perspectives regarding eating and drinking. There is so little I have control over. I want to choose what I can eat and drink. Eating and drinking is so much more than nutrition. We have gotten so skilled with understanding the human body at a molecular level, but within this, we still need to deliver care which affirms, empathizes, and humanizes those we are caring for. Next slide. So rather than a specific set of decision-making factors or criteria which can be applied to each person, it has been suggested in the literature that decision-making is better conceptualized as a problem-solving process, involving the person, their families, and staff, weighing and balancing information on identification of risks, burdens and benefits, treatment goals, multidisciplinary actions, and future planning. Next slide. The guidance on eating and drinking with acknowledged risks was fundamentally designed on placing personal choices at the heart of the decision-making process. We proposed the use of recommendations rather than a tick box or a step-by-step guide, as the actions alter according to the setting. You cannot fly a plane or sail a boat with checklists. So instead, the recommendations provide reminders of the critical elements to enable thoroughness within decision-making. The individual's choices and humanness make this process an imperfect science. There is no one size fits all. Look at the individual in front of you, their wishes, food preferences, mealtime routines, cultural, religious, and spiritual beliefs associated with food are all intrinsic to the assessment. Further to that, understanding the psychosocial impact of eating, drinking, swallowing difficulties and its associated interventions on a person's well-being are all necessary ingredients to factor into a supportive framework for decision-making. Next slide. And how true is this? We spend a lot of time designing the bridge, but not enough time thinking about the people who are crossing it. Next slide. Eating, drinking, swallowing difficulties are prevalent in a number of conditions such as head and neck cancer, neurological, neurodegenerative diseases, including learning disability. So the guidance was written and is applicable to adults with dysphagia across these population groups. A culmination of our core values, our ability to feel empathy, respect, understanding, and compassion as clinicians, acting within a shared care approach which is accessible, magnifies individualized care. The consideration of social, cultural, psychological factors when eating and drinking are essential to person-centered care, irrespective of whether care is being delivered in the community or the hospital, or indeed in the person's own home. These primary components are pivotal to the decision-making process. Next slide. The catalyst, therefore, appears to be explicit discussions on the risks leading to a possible deterioration of health against the backdrop of quality of life. The outcome of the decision is then likely to be one of dignity. It is about providing sufficient information to build mutual trust through this holistic, empathetic approach, whilst applying proportionality by researching the facts and understanding the clinical picture. Next slide. When is a good time to start discussions? As early as possible, at the time of diagnosis, with the anticipation of a deterioration in the ability to swallow. In a study by Anantapong et al. In 2021, participants in the early stages of dementia expressed a preference for leaving decision-making around eating and drinking difficulties to whenever it arose through the disease progression, although there was the awareness that this could then be burdensome on their family. What was clear was the ability to eat and drink represented quality of life and something they could control. There was a general opposition to alternative nutrition and hydration in reference to tube feeding, as this route was perceived to be unnatural. Anantapong et al. In their 2022 paper reported family and carers' frustrations on assumptions staff made about their relatives' preferences and ability to eat and drink. One carer indicated that whilst the person with severe dementia could not exercise their authority on their medical treatment, they could on the food they ate, emphasizing the cultural and personal meaning of eating and drinking. Next slide. So 3 years on, where are we at? There's a greater awareness within the profession on centering quality of life over risks. This is evident in the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists position paper on use of thickeners in practice. There appears to be a greater understanding that there is no linear relationship between aspiration and eating and drinking, swallowing difficulties, that there are a number of contributory factors, such as poor oral hygiene, compromised positioning, dependency on receiving food and drink, as well as dysphagia, that can lead to a number of risks, such as malnutrition, dehydration, and aspiration pneumonia. This leads on well to what seems to be a general acceptance around the terminology of eating and drinking with acknowledged risks, where there is an intentional plural on risks to highlight that the compromised swallowing can result in a number of risks as just detailed, such as malnutrition and dehydration. There's also the understanding that terminology will be adapted for relevant conversations across respective settings. It is reassuring to see the incorporation of ethical dilemmas in the pre-registration eating, drinking, swallowing competencies document, which has led to a paradigm shift in SLT education. At Greenwich University, there is the scaffolded spiral approach across the BSc curriculum, with ethics embedded within the first year of study as part of the foundations of academic skills and practice. There are illustrated clinical scenarios to work through in year 2 of the program, and integrated clinical reasoning through application and problem solving in year 3. In addition, of course, to the learning that occurs whilst a student is on placement. There appears to be a growing support for I would say nationally and globally, for a coordinated approach to implementing EDAR, with services and organizations taking the basic principles and adopting these to suit their respective settings, as evidenced within the recent portfolio of papers by Anantapong and colleagues, as well as the systematic review by Saw et al. In 2021. All references are included in the references slide at the end of my presentation. Although there is ongoing debate on the benefits of the protocols and policies around EDAR in the community versus the hospital, many services nationally and internationally discuss the positive outcomes reported when a protocol is part of practice, with a more holistic, best interest decision-making approach being taken forward, including clarification and ownership of the multidisciplinary roles and responsibilities. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be worth expanding with a mini critique on some of the enablers and barriers to protocols and policies that have been highlighted through practice, but also in a current literature review. Whilst a protocol can be useful in capturing the processes such as capacity assessment, consideration of medicines administration, and advanced care planning, there has been cited misuse in the way of expediting discharge to free up a hospital bed, only to find a readmission a few days later. What was seen to be useful in mitigating these circumstances and enhancing the coordination of care was the use of a policy with a protocol. Protocols serve as a catalyst to personalizing care, outlining key recommendations, furnishing what Alex might refer to as a fact-specific risk assessment. Further to this, what has been seen in practice is avoiding protocols, notably when there are differing IT systems across care settings, can lead to issues with transfers of care during admissions and discharges. The benefit with having an organizational policy is tremendous in implementing a pathway of care, ensuring clarity of the respective MDT responsibilities, as well as with setting up rolling education programs. One of the disadvantages raised, however, is that policies and protocols can put the focus of dysphagia practice on preventing aspiration rather than optimization of nutrition and hydration. So this was just merely a quick summary for you to consider of the support for and some of the tensions that have arisen with the use of protocols and policies. You can then decide what might work best for your local environments. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish my part of this webinar with a quote from Mr. Nelson Mandela. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. I invite you to listen with openness to the case of JJ and consider the following questions. How would the consideration of EDAR have impacted on JJ's care? Should food be classed as a treatment or a fundamental choice? Do we sometimes over-medicalize care? Are we using the guidelines to ensure a robust, person-centered decision, or purely as a means to protecting staff delivering the care? And to expand, can there be a dual approach to embedding the recommendations in the decision-making process with keeping care person-centered, whilst authorizing and acknowledging the risks? Just some pointers to reflect on as you hear from Alex. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Darren. And those are three very, very pertinent questions to frame for people while they're listening. So just to explain a tiny bit more about me, I'm a barrister. I specialise in mental capacity, mental health, clinical ethics. I'm also a visiting professor at King's College London, where I teach law at the end of life. And I've been involved in a lot of clinical guidelines, including for present purposes, the two relevant ones being the Royal College of Physicians one and then the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapist one on eating and drinking at acknowledged risk. And what I'm going to do is walk you through the relevant bits in the RCP and RCSLT guidance, which were dealing with the dilemma about how do we think about acknowledging the fact there's always more than one person involved. You've got the person, the individual concerned, but you have the team around the person. And so both bits of guidance, we're trying to think that through. And then I'm going to talk about the case of JJ, which is a very challenging case. I will declare I was involved on behalf of the Royal College of Physicians in the Court of Appeal. And then I'm going to try and think through how can we respond realistically. And that's really the word I want to try and focus on in the context of respond realistically to the JJ decision. So with that, can I go full Chris Whitty and have the next slide, please? So this was the guidance from the Royal College of Physicians supporting people who have eating and drinking difficulties, 2021. And this is the relevant bit. And there are a couple of extracts. I'm not going to read them all out because that'd be grindingly awful, but I just wanted to make sure that people had ready access to them. These were the bits which were dealing with a dilemma. In any risk feeding, and that fully acknowledging there are lots of sensitivities around that term, that's one of the reasons why it's in inverted commas there. There needs to be a calibration between being risk averse and placing carers in an impossible position in the name of patient autonomy. And so the Royal College of Physicians, and as I said, I was involved with the working group. Adult with capacity can choose to make a decision which appears to others to be unwise. That's a point just to pause and remind us, as Judith really helpfully reminded us at the beginning of the webinar, this is predominantly looking at England and Wales. The position in Scotland is slightly different in terms of capacity law. The position in Northern Ireland is different in terms of capacity law, and I know we've got at least one person listening from Ireland. The position there is different. And I put a link in chat function to two things which might be helpful in thinking that through. But back to this. Adult with capacity can choose to make a decision that appears to be others to be unwise. Could include a decision that wish to be fed in a way which puts other people at risk. If the person has properly understood that risk, then if the people act with due care, shouldn't be exposed to any liability if they do in fact suffer adverse consequences. But RCP guidance did identify, and I do think it's perhaps important just to identify, this was the first guidance of which I'm aware where this issue was in fact tackled head on as opposed to not talked about. There might be some situations where the carers may feel the risks are so great they properly cannot respond. And then, of course, then think through how can you make sure that that can be addressed? And are there ways in which that can be mitigated? Are there ways in which people can achieve a negotiated outcome which properly addresses everyone's interests, starting, of course, with the patient themselves? And then we suggested, RCP suggested, please go and find a lawyer. Lawyers are not all that useful all the time. This is, and as we'll come to, we might find lawyers were very unhelpful a bit later. But go and find a lawyer to think through how can we sort this out, possibly needing to go to court. So next slide, please. Similarly, you might have a situation where the patient lacks capacity to make the decision. There, the RCP were predominantly thinking about adults lacking capacity. I'm not going to talk too much about pediatrics, but I have, in fact, I'm not really going to talk about pediatrics. I put a link in the chat function to a useful article from Australia thinking about EDAR in a pediatric context. Again, it might be a situation where the person's known wishes and feelings are very clearly to be fed in a certain way. Again, team conscientiously considers to place the person at an unacceptable high level of risk. Responsibility there is clearly going to lie with the team, not with the person. Again, best interest decision could be taken to best interest decision making should be done to try and think things through. It might be that one gets to the point where it simply can't be said, actually, we think this is in their best interest. Again, go and find a legal advice. I just wanted to emphasize that because this had not really been addressed head on in any previous guidance. And then the message, and I'm going to just keep coming back to this one, I'm afraid, is the second paragraph. It is the critical thing. The approach set out was not intended to serve as a license for either individual decisions to be made or policies adopted based on undue risk aversion. That's the thing to hold on to. Balance, but not undue risk aversion. And if you're feeling nerdly enthusiastic and you want to read a case, the only case I could think of when I was trying to provide some input here, which talked about how you could think this through, where you've got more than one person's interest in play, was that decision in A and others, which was about manual handling. Some individuals that was known wanted to be handled in one way, not have a hoist. The carers involved felt using hoist would expose the carers to undue risk of injury and also would be undignified. A judge had to think that through. That's where we stood when the RCP guidance was published in 2021. Could I get the next slide, please? And then the guidance, the brilliant guidance that Darren led on, the EDAR guidance from your college, and how the two interact. RCP guidance, the primary guidance for care and clinical assistance, RCSLT guidance, really digging down into the nuances about the decision making. So next slide, please. Again, overall goal, supporting decision making process irrespective of the person having capacity to accept the risk involved or otherwise, and trying to think through, very clear, someone might be saying, I want this, I accept this risk. Again, very clear, that might also be the case, known in the context of somebody's wishes and feelings. It's perhaps fair to say that this guidance does not perhaps address in quite such express terms where the carers are saying we're uncomfortable, but the two bits of guidance are consistent. RCP overall framework, RCSLT really digging down into this bit. So that's where we stood in 2021. If we could just have the next slide, please. And then we have this case, and I'm really glad Darren gave it, actually saying the word health warning here is probably entirely inappropriate, but I'm glad that Darren flagged this up. It's a difficult case. So can I just give you a bit of the background for it? Some of you will be familiar. I should say I've had my email inbox melting since this case came out, and I know the RCSLT team have as well. It's important I'm going to have to get legal for a second in terms of explaining how it was working. What this wasn't was a judge making a decision as to whether the right thing to do was to go ahead with feeding in acknowledged risk in this particular case. It was a different form of case. What was happening was that there was a quadriplegic prisoner, completely reliant on others to provide him with nutrition and hydration. He was essentially, all he could move was one finger. That was it. He had, for a period of time, had been provided with boiled sweets, biscuits and crisps, which were clearly improving his quality of life. The healthcare team in the hospital, run by a community interest company called Spectrum, say, actually, we've thought about this, that we think that the risk of aspiration is too high. We cannot keep providing boiled sweets, biscuits and crisps, because if we provide these and you die, our team are going to be exposed to criminal proceedings, regulatory proceedings, will be challenged, and not just challenged, potentially prosecuted. It is super important to understand. I am not going to get into whether or not that risk assessment was correct, but that's what was being said. JJ was inconsistently refusing any other form of nutrition. JJ essentially had zero form of control in his life. A prisoner serving a long prison sentence, no quality of life as far as he could identify. All he wanted was boiled sweets, biscuits and crisps. He plus minus consistently refused other food. He did actually ultimately accept various forms of nutrition which were keeping him alive, but he was saying, I just want these. He also made an advanced decision to refuse treatment, confirming that food refusal was to apply even if his life was at risk and he didn't want to be ventilated or have CPR. I think what JJ was trying to do, I don't know, but my speculation is what JJ was trying to do was really try and emphasize the risk was on him. He was trying to tell the team, I am taking all the risk here. I completely understand, and there was no doubt about his mental capacity. I completely understand there is a real risk of aspiration here. I'm willing to take it. As we'll see in a minute, that advanced decision to refuse treatment really rather backfired in a way. So next slide, please. So the judge, actually, sorry, previous slide, I've maybe just gone a bit too far. Sorry, just go back one. So the judge at first instance says, I can't say, and I'm not going to say, that Spectrum are acting unlawfully in saying we won't feed. Because I'm going to accept their evidence that if he has this boiled sweets, crisps, snacks, he may well die, and they may well be exposed to criminal prosecution, regulatory action. In the context of that, I am not going to say they're acting unlawfully. JJ didn't stop there. Next slide, please. So JJ appeals to the Court of Appeal. And so JJ, before the Court of Appeal, is raising two issues. What he is not doing is bringing medical evidence in to say, for instance, the speech and language therapists involved in the case had been wrong in their risk assessment. There was no medical evidence filed on his behalf, because there wouldn't normally be in what's called a judicial review challenge. You don't normally have medical evidence going backwards and forwards. You have a judge looking at whether the public body are acting rationally. And so JJ is raising these two stark issues before the Court of Appeal. This is one of the starkest cases I've done some pretty stark medical treatment cases. This is one of the starkest medical treatment cases I've ever done. So before the Court of Appeal, two issues are there. His team framed this. They say, we want to frame this as it being a question of choice. This is about patient choice. No one is saying JJ has anything other than unimpaired mental capacity to make decisions about eating in this way. So why should he not be allowed to choose? Simple argument, attractive argument in many ways. The judge at first instance, so the first judge who looked at this, and the legal team for Spectrum was saying, no, it's not about choice. It's about clinical appropriateness. It's about, is it clinically appropriate to provide the biscuits, sweets and crisps in this context? Because if it's not clinically appropriate, no one can demand it. So stark, was it his choice or was it about clinical appropriateness? And it also raised the question of what constitutes medical treatment. And that's actually an issue which is going to have, I think, some really interesting, and when a lawyer says interesting, you don't want interesting, you don't want me to say that, some wider ramifications. So those were the two key questions before the Court of Appeal. Next slide, please. I should just perhaps say the RCP intervened in this case, because when I read the first instance judgment, I went, it is extraordinary that no one appears to have brought to the attention of the court that two major clinical bodies have just issued guidance about how to think this through. I cannot believe no one appeared to be aware of the RCSLT guidance or the RCP guidance. So I got in touch with the RCP. RCP intervened to say, by the way, this guidance exists, both bits of guidance. It was squarely before the court. So the Court of Appeal answers the question of, is this about choice? First, and so what the judge says, giving a lead judgment, says, look, and actually I very vividly remember at one stage, Lady Justice King, very, very experienced judge in the Court of Appeal, who's heard a lot of court protection cases, so a lot of medical treatment cases. She says, this is medical law 101. If you have capacity, you get to choose between the various options which are put on the table. And that choice has to be respected, even if it isn't the one the clinical team are thinking is the right thing. And a patient with capacity can just say no to anything, even if it gives rise to their death. So the critical question the Court of Appeal says, well, does it then extend further? Can I say, it's not a question of refusal, it's a question of saying, I want to be fed in this way. I want, in JJ's case, I want you to provide me with biscuits, sweets and crisps, because that is what I want in order to have some quality of life. And you can see there, the answer to that question is no. It's an unequivocal no. If the clinicians, and the judges here use the word clinicians to try and encompass everybody involved on the medical side, whether or not you quite identify as medical side, I'll have a discussion about that later. If they don't think it's appropriate, you can't demand it. So JJ ran up against a brick wall of this is not about choice. This is about constrained choice. This option is not on the table. We're not going to say, the court said, we're not going to say that the Spectrum are wrong in their analysis of risk, therefore JJ can't demand it. And it didn't help when he tried to run the argument, I've got a right to private life, I've got including autonomy, please take that into account. So that's the next slide. Sorry, next slide, please. And the other bit, which is a bit of a zinger, to use a non-legal term. So there, the court of, because some of you might be thinking, well, why on earth is anyone talking about medical treatment here and clinical appropriateness? This is sweets. Like, that is not, you don't think you go to the GP to get prescribed sweets. Like, why is that medical treatment? The thing here, though, is that the Court of Appeal says, because JJ is completely dependent on everybody else, foods such as boiled sweets become part of medical treatment. So it's the actions of the people providing JJ with the sweets, which translate it, sort of magic transformation from they're just sweets into an aspect of medical treatment and care. They rely on a case many of you might be familiar with about Tony Bland, the last Hillsborough victim. He'd been receiving clinically assisted nutrition and hydration. That's not biscuits, boiled sweets and crisps. But they extrapolate from that the principle that if someone is intervening, in effect, to carry the sweets from the tin into the person's mouth, that starts feeling like medical treatment, which is why it then comes back to clinical appropriateness. So next slide, please. A lot of text, I won't read it all out, but in effect, this is all the stuff which Spectrum put up to say, we're in real trouble if JJ has food in the way he wants it and dies. We could be prosecuted by the CQC, England only, but equivalent prosecutions could happen in other jurisdictions for exposing somebody to avoidable harm or significant risk of harm. They could be prosecuted, they think, for prosecution under Health and Safety at Work Act, possibly even gross negligence manslaughter. I mean, that's pretty high. But in effect, as you can see there, defendant's conduct departed from the proper standard of care incumbent upon him, a risk of death to the patient. If you're so bad, in terms of the duty of care you owed, you could be prosecuted. And the court says this is a non-trivial, we can't ignore this because Spectrum are telling us we can't ignore it. So I'm banging on about the way in which the cases were put by JJ and the way in which the cases were put by Spectrum, because that really lays out why the Court of Appeal reaches the conclusion, well, some of the ways in which the Court of Appeal reaches the conclusion it does. So next slide, please. So let's just think this through before we turn to the response. Did it constitute a change in the law? Or did it do nothing more than clarify a previously, and I have to say, rather potentially helpful grey area? I think the reality is it might arguably have changed the law somewhat in terms of the definition of medical treatment, in terms of expanding it out from the conventional definition. But that's partly, I suspect, because no one had ever actually asked that question before in quite that way. Previously, it was an incredibly helpful grey area. And it was a grey area within which the RCP guidance could be drafted. It was a grey area within which the RCSLT guidance could be drafted. And now it's really annoying that, in effect, if someone goes to Trust Legal and says, could I be prosecuted if I do X, Y, and Z and this person dies? The answer cannot be anything other than, yes, it is a possibility. And Trust Legal can't say that that's not the case because they've got the Court of Appeal saying it. But hold on, let's not panic yet. I think it's also a case which really in some ways brings home the old saying that hard cases make bad law. If I may say so, I really wish this case had not been brought. I understand why JJ, a prisoner with no control, probably got himself into something of a standoff with the clinical team. And I understand why JJ, a prisoner with no control, tried to resolve that standoff by bringing a case to court to assert his autonomy. One understands why all of those things. The problem is that when you ask the questions that JJ did of a court was never going to give anything other than the answers that they gave. And I'm reinforced in that by the fact that he then tried to take this case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused him permission to appeal earlier this year on the basis that there is no point of law which requires argument here. It is unbelievably important to emphasize, though, now as we start to move into how do we think about it realistically, this was a fact-specific risk assessment by the team in prison. I'm not going to comment on the nature of that assessment. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to do so, but that was the assessment that the SLT team reached there. This was not a judicial endorsement of never do anything which is risky. It absolutely wasn't. It's also, I have to say, unfortunate, but it is just what it is. It's because he chose to bring the case in the way that he did, just saying you're acting unlawfully by refusing to treat me or feed me. There was no independent assessment of the risk. There was no alternative medical, clinical, social work, SLT perspective put forward to say there might be another way of looking at this. So the judges were entirely bound by that one perspective. So that's the aftermath, and that explains one of the reasons why, A, we're actually having this webinar, but B, my emails are still on fire from speech and language therapists in particular going, how am I supposed to think about this? So I'm not a speech and language therapist. I'm not a clinician of any kind. I am merely a lawyer. But can I now just give you some thoughts about how we can think through how to think about responding to this realistically? So next slide, please. So blindingly obvious, but needs asserting more than ever. Negotiation about acceptable methods of feeding. There might have been an acceptable method of reaching a conclusion in JJ's case, which met his demand and the clinical team's demand in a way both of them might not be entirely comfortable with. And that might be the case in many, many other cases. Have that negotiation. Critically, being realistic about risk and reducing the risk to the ALARC principle as low as reasonably practicable. Thinking of all the ways in which you can say, we recognise there is a risk here. I know I keep using the word risk and you'd like me not to use the word risk, but I've got to because that's how the courts are talking about it. Is there a way in which we can manage the chances of something potentially going wrong as best we can? And I can tell you with a relative degree of confidence that if something does happen and does eventuate, the fact that people have been through a robust process to say, we thought this through in the best we can in terms of reducing the risk, that is always going to carry weight. There is the potential of approaching the courts. There's the potential of approaching the courts in the situation where people know in their heart of hearts, we know the right thing to do here is to enable that person to have the thing that they want. But we recognise there is a chance of aspiration. And it's a chance of aspiration we simply cannot get round in any other way. And there is a way, let's try and think this through. Well, you might be able to go to the High Court. I'm not going to give you legal advice, but go to the High Court that it is lawful to feed in the presence of risk. To go and say, we recognise it's risky. Please, can you tell us that we would like, that the right thing to do here to support this patient's autonomy is to go ahead. Similarly, in the context of court of protection, go to the court of protection and say, we know the most important thing for this person is to be fed in this way. We recognise the risk. We would really like to do it. I do just have to caveat that there is a limit to the court's ability or willingness to give, and it's a bit crass to say this, but a get out of jail card free. Or get out of jail free card. There's a limit to how much they can say in advance, it's okay to do this. Some judges are more willing than others, and I've experienced of judges being quite robust about saying, I know the right thing to do here, what the right thing to do is, and I'm willing to support the people who want to do it. And judges, by the way, can't be sacked for the decisions they make as judges. So they have a higher ability to carry risk on their shoulders than people who might face criminal prosecution, regulatory action, a coroner saying, what on earth were you up to? Judges can have very broad shoulders. So sometimes there might be situations where when you're going to legal, the question for legal is not, what should we do? The question for legal is, we know what we want to do, give us the tools to do it. I would strongly suggest that is the starter for 10 with the discussion with legal, because that's what lawyers are meant to be there for, enabling people to achieve the right outcome. And if you go in that will lead to a different discussion to, will be done if we feed and this person dies? Because the answer will be yes. And you just set yourself up for a very risk-averse type conversation. So next slide, please. I thought it might just be helpful. I was just trying to think through anything to assist you. There is a possible bit of an analogy here. Section 44 Mental Capacity Act, none of you will have ever read. It's actually really important. It protects people with impaired decision-making capacity against ill treatment or willful neglect. It's a really important thing. You might be thinking, no, I don't really want to be told about another thing I might be done for. But what I wanted to just flag, this was a judgment from a few years ago. You can see 2012 Court of Appeal decision. And there the Court of Appeal was saying, look, when we're thinking this through, and you can see this red text, actions or omissions or a combination of both, which reflect or are believed to reflect the protected autonomy of the individual needing care, don't constitute willful neglect. So the Court of Appeal was trying to give the message there, when we are thinking things through in terms of whether people have really done what they should have done or shouldn't have done, we do need to pay proper respect to the person's known wishes and feelings. That was on the incapacity side. The same should go on the capacitus side. So I think that's my last slide. Can I just double check? Yes, it is. Just a couple of resources, and then we can throw the floor open to questions. The top link there is my chamber's website. There's a summary of the case of JJ on there, and various other resources, including there was a discussion earlier on about the role of thinking about speech and language therapists and capacity. There's guidance on how to think about capacity on that website. The middle one there, Mental Capacity Law and Policy, has got a range of things, including 20 minutes from me on capacity. It's also got a brilliant 20 minutes with Alex Lua talking about the role of speech and language therapists in capacity assessment. So definitely recommend that. And that's me done, I think, in terms of slide presentation, and I shall look nervously at the questions.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Darren, for your fabulous presentations, and the question and answer box has been blowing up. Thank you very much, Kathleen, for fielding some of the questions as they come in as we're talking. I think there are a significant number of themes that are coming up in the chat box, which are covered in the pre-themed questions that we have for you, if we may. So what I'd like to do, if that's all right with everybody, is to move on to the questions that we theme, just because I think we have a comparatively short time in which to try and solve these problems. I think what the message I am taking away from all of this is, this is not simple and it is not binary. And I think that is absolutely why we are all here today. But there are some things that we can do and some support to help us do that. So my first question really is targeted at Darren, but then of course I'll come back to you, Alex, for your thoughts on it, is going back to the evidence base, really. So considering the limitations of the evidence base around this work, how do we communicate the severity and likelihood of the risks identified within this process? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good question to put forward the example of why it's useful in practice to have a protocol guiding us through the consideration of respective aspects of care. So firstly, considering the goal of intervention draws us to look carefully at the presenting medical condition. And why that's useful is, for example, if the diagnosis is one of dementia, then we can go back to the literature, and there's a significantly large literature evidence base, quite extensive, on the spotlight of quality of life over alternative nutrition and hydration. In addition, the swallow assessment is going to flag up key factors, not just on consistencies and textures, but also contributory factors like position and mouth care and levels of dependency, all key markers towards determining levels of risk. Important to factor in medicine's administration when considering severity and likelihood of risks. And you can, in some instances, conduct a video fluoroscopy, tapping into the objective assessment as a means to quantify risk, beneficial particularly with the capacitous individuals from a visual educational perspective.
Thank you. That's really helpful, because I think the word risk is bandied around hugely, when actually, from exactly what you were saying, Alex, earlier, is we have constrained choice as well as all sorts of other pieces of information around that to make the full picture, which is full of how we function within an individual. I think the issue is this is about individual choice as well within that, which is why I think that adds whole levels of complexity to it. I don't know, Alex, whether there's anything further you'd like to add to that, especially around the issues of risk. No. Okay, that's fine. Don't have to. There's plenty more questions to come through for that one. So thank you. So if I may, I'd like to move on that theme of risk, which is rather handy. I'd like to segue back to you again, Darren, in the first instance, of how do you think we shift from a risk-averse culture to a risk-enabling approach? Because that's really what we're talking about here, isn't it?
So keeping the individual in front of you, having a clear clinical picture, as well as the understanding of the individual's wishes. It's ethically complex when risks are overt, and as clinicians we are taught to keep individuals safe, inverted commas, as safe as possible. Therefore, it will understandably sit uncomfortably when we are presented with facilitating these decisions and discussions, as it's likely to go against that assurance of eliminating risk. But two things to consider in this vein: are there not risks with alternative nutrition and hydration too? And secondly, but integrally, is our intervention about eliminating the risks, or is it about managing the risks? And there was a quote that I sometimes use in presentations, which goes to the effect of risk comes from not knowing what we are doing. So arguably, would the risks not be increased further if there was no framework to pull these multifactorial processes together? And we have the guidelines, such as the Royal College of Physicians document, the Royal College document with EDAR guidance, and it's an area of care that requires really the mindset to treat the person, not the condition, and use the available tools. I think it's brilliant that we are including the subject matter within the curriculum at pre-registration level, as that's one way to tackle the development of a risk-enabling culture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of shifting the whole focus, isn't it, on who we're doing this for? And I think that is really very powerful. Again, is there anything you'd like to add to that, Alex?
No, I'm just thoroughly endorsing everything Darren is saying. So
Fantastic. I love it when there's so much congruence. That's lovely. I think there's been lots of questions in the chat, but also lots of questions previously, really about the role of the speech and language therapists and what their responsibilities are within this work. Because I think there's quite a lot of anxiety around where we're back to risk, but also about who holds and makes these decisions. So I'm going to go to you first, Darren, in terms of what you feel as a speech and language therapist about what the role is and what our responsibility is. And then I'd like to wonder whether there's a legal perspective you'd like to add to that, Alex.
So broadly, various avenues. Assessment, firstly, being able to conduct a thorough specialist assessment. There's a significant role within advocacy, ensuring information is accessible, especially when you're having discussions with families and service users, pulling various strands and processes together, the capacity assessment for nutrition. So certainly there are trusts and there are organizations where the speech and language therapist would be taking care of the capacity assessment for nutrition. Links with the relevant team members, the pharmacists, the physiotherapists, and documentation. Can't stress it more. Yeah.
Thank you. And there's a cat somewhere in the
I'm
background
so
who's desperate to
sorry.
join us.
It's really annoyed that I've got the door shut, so I really apologize.
Everybody's welcome is all I can say. I just heard it and I thought, gosh, that's quite an angst-ridden sounding plea from the background. So thank you, Darren. Alex, would you want to add anything to that?
So one of the things I would say is this is one of those bits where the concept of shared decision making just gets really complicated and annoyingly difficult, because you're then sharing the decision making as between the person and then the team, but then within the team, who is actually holding responsibility. And then frequently, in my experience, and this is not just limited to this situation, the person who is notionally holding responsibility may well not be the person who's got most day-to-day direct contact with the person. They may well also have quite different perspectives on what's going on from those people who've got most day-to-day contact. So part of it is about how you can get functioning teams where all those voices can be heard. And that, if I may say so, is particularly important when we're then thinking about people who might lack capacity. Because apart from anything else, one of the issues of the Mental Capacity Act is you don't have a formal designated decision maker, England and Wales. So you can then run the risk of getting even more complicated as to who is actually making any decision here. And then you can get even more annoying arguments about, well, is the person making the decision the person who's supposed to be assessing capacity, or do we then go and get, I mean, the whole thing just gets really mucky really quickly. I will just put a guidance note from our chambers about best interest decision making, which talks a bit about who is the decision maker and tries to think it through. But the spoiler alert on that, or the one-liner on that, is best interest decision making, and I would say non-best interest, as in capacitors thinking through shared things. It's an aspect of good clinical governance. And if you've got a good team working well, you'll have the different perspectives heard, the different perspectives respected, and you don't have people stamped on because they don't have the right letters before or after their name, all of those sorts of things. I'm not naming disciplines, I'm not doing anything. I am just providing an external perspective from having seen quite a lot of these situations. And what always worries me is if there is not a channel for somebody to be raising, you know what, I think this is the wrong thing. And that could be the wrong thing that we're being too risk averse. It could equally be the wrong thing being we're in a terribly risk positive environment. And I think actually this is out of hand. I do want to emphasize, I think things can go wrong both ways. And it's how you recognize, how do I have that voice for that one person? And that's a question for each trust, for each body, for each whatever. So that's sort of a non-answer, but it's trying to think through some of the experiences I've seen and had and seen in different organizations.
No, thank you, Alex. And I think I absolutely agree. It's about the quality of the team around that person making that decision, and it's often very difficult. And if you're straddling different organizations, who is it that holds that? And the transition piece, speech and language therapists I always think of as glue for sometimes with these patients as they travel and transition between organizations. So thank you. Darren, is there anything you'd like to add? Or actually, what I want to do is to move on, if I may, to the next question, which I think we've almost answered, but this is one of the biggest questions that came up in the pre-registration questions. And I think you've almost answered it, but I wondered whether you wanted to add anything, especially around capacity, non-capacity in particular, is do we, and I think we as probably speech and language therapists, or we as the team, need medical sign-off for this decision from a clinical and legal perspective? So I think it's sort of the next stage on. You've sort of said no, but that's around MCA, but what about within this piece of work? And then the second part of that is, would we get different answers if the patient had capacity or not? So it's a sort of a 4-part question, and have we answered it? I'm going to go to you first, Alex, on this one, if I may.
So I'm going to annoyingly duck it because the law doesn't say anything, if you see what I mean. There is no legal requirement that X person does Y in any given situation, which is both good and bad, if you see what I mean. What the law is demanding is a coherent plan being drawn up by people and responsibility being taken and reasonable steps, for instance, being taken to think about capacity, best interest, all that malarkey. I mean, really important, but it's that kind of stuff. The law just doesn't descend down to X person does Y in any given situation. Y's responsibility is to prescribe it. It's that kind of stuff. So I'm going to not comment other than make that comment, if you see what I mean, because I think it gets wildly inappropriate for a lawyer to then start telling clinicians, speech and language therapists, medics, whoever else might be listening, how they are supposed to discharge their jobs. It's just not my place, and I wouldn't want to overstep my place.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And the last thing I want to do is to compromise you, but that's really useful for clinicians on this call. I think there is a lot of a culture around who makes these decisions, maybe especially in an acute unit. But I wouldn't like to point fingers at any clinician in particular, but I think there may be some that make decisions more regularly than others and are respected and seen as decision makers. But I don't know, Darren, whether there's anything you'd like to add to that question or comment from an SLT viewpoint.
If I may, just from clinical experience, within hospital settings, it appears, and this might just be going through a governance perspective or lens, but the consultants do want to have overriding decision sign off, so to speak, and therefore I would say, and I say that we would very gladly sit together with the individual. So it's not that they are making the decision, but they do want to ultimately be able to sign off. So all the documentation within the hospital settings and the exposure that I've had within acute settings, it was that's the way it seemed to run. However, with the communities, the GPs had differing perspectives, and they were happy for teams to sit together, have a best interests meeting, and inform them about the decision. And what used to concern me was that if there was an incident before the decision was communicated to the GP, where does that leave everyone? But I would refer everyone back to their local organizations, because I think that's probably the best place to start, where everybody sits together and for this organization decides the way forward.
Thank you. And it's absolutely back to teamwork, documentation, and understanding how we can all work together in this really thorny issue. So thank you very much. So if I can move us on a little bit now, there were a lot of questions initially, and there's a lot in the chat as well, about if a family member or informal carer or person with an LPA disagrees with the EDAR decision, either to EDAR or not EDAR, what steps should the SLT take? And should it be escalated to the legal safeguarding team? So this is really about protecting professionally within that situation and compliance. I don't know which one of you would like to take that question first. Alex, clearly. Graceful.
I love that gesture. Just please make it go away. So, I mean, I suppose this is partly well. Let us work on the presumption, and I hate making presumptions. So let's work on the presumption here that the individual in question does not have capacity to make the relevant decision. So therefore, in England and Wales, we are then thinking about best interest decision making. And at that point, I think the thing I want to be clearest on is there is no, I mean, just to repeat this almost default, the decision maker point. Unlike lots of other jurisdictions, and I do loads of work, kind of comparative work, and for people who are not from England and Wales or UK, the thing I think people find the most difficult to get their head around, you don't have an identified surrogate decision maker. If you're from America, if you're from most European countries, if Darani doesn't have capacity to make a decision, then there'll just be a person who the doctors or the clinicians or whoever else will go to say what happens. It's so unusual in England and Wales that we have a system which is there's supposed to be a collaborative group hug decision-making process where everybody's views are taken into account, and then we reach a conclusion as to what the right course of action is for that person, taking into account wishes and feelings, beliefs and values. It's a brilliant system. The problem is what happens when we've got differences of opinion. And then you have to think through how do we resolve those differences of opinion? Do we have a situation where we can say the course of action is one that we properly can say we reasonably believe is in the person's best interests, in which case go ahead. If you don't. Because if you're providing treatment which is not in someone's best interest, that is assault, and I'm not going to stand there and defend you. I just won't. The bit which gets complicated is where, and to the extent you've got family members disagreeing, then of course, just because the person is a family member, remember, no such thing as next of kin doesn't exist. Family member, person with clear views, but of course, the family member who's estranged, but has very strong views, not very useful in terms of giving input into wishes and feelings, beliefs and values. So you have to think through, where is this objection coming from? And is this objection coming from the family member's own fears, or is it coming about in terms of this person would want or wouldn't want? And then just one thing on lasting powers of attorney, assuming that it is a health and welfare one, it's registered with the Office of the Public Guardian, it is in fact a power of attorney, never assume, you are always allowed to ask. And then if the attorney says, I don't think this is the right course of action, and the team collectively go, we think it is, it's like marriage counselling. The issue at that point is we don't have an agreement about best interest, we need to think it through. If you can get a genuine agreement, and it might be that the family member LPA feeds in information the team didn't have previously, and everyone goes, oh, I didn't realise that. Always think of it that way round. It could not just be that you browbeaten the family member into changing their mind. If you can't get a genuine agreement, that is a situation where the only person who can tell you what is in the person's best interest is a court of protection judge. Please don't waste time with the Office of the Public Guardian. That is looking into, is this person the right sort of person to be an attorney? If you've got a decision about, do we go ahead and do feeding here in the name of the person's best interest, and you can't get proper resolution, court of protection. I would also just say that is also the route where there is a split within the team. And I've had cases where the team is completely split, not EDAR, but other cases where the medical team are completely split as to what the right thing to do is. Have to go to the court of protection. That's the only place you get the resolution of that issue. So rather long answer, but it also just allowed me to talk about next of kin, which drives me up the wall, and lasting powers of attorney, which are consistently problematic here. Darani, please give the much more grounded, realistic answer than the one.
Not at all. In fact, I wanted you to just please explain how INCA fits into this. Please.
Yep. No, thank you. So an IMCA needs to be involved if it is a serious medical treatment decision being proposed by an NHS body. And that may not be all situations we are considering. And I was having this discussion yesterday on some other training. GPs aren't NHS bodies. I mean, there's a problem there, actually. But if there's for this purpose, they NHS for other contexts, but where you've got serious medical treatment, which is being proposed, and serious medical treatment is either treatment which is in and of itself serious, or the consequences are serious. and the person's so-called unbefriended. So in other words, they've got nobody who's not professionally involved in their care, who can assist, trying to think through what the right course of action is, and IMCA has to be instructed. So whether or not an IMCA needs to be instructed in a decision about eating and drinking acknowledged risk will depend on the consequences, but it will also really weirdly and frankly annoyingly depend on who is involved in the decision making, which you may feel is just completely wrong. But one of the problems, and if you do feel it is wrong, RCSLT might want to consider lobbying to change the law, change the regulation. So IMCAs, there's a power to appoint IMCAs where someone's unbefriended and there is a serious decision to be made. Because you might well think that would actually be might be helpful. Depends on your experience of IMCAs, but it might well be helpful to have someone external to go, how do we think this through? How can we get the person's voice properly heard? But at the moment, where there's a duty to appoint an IMCA, NHS body has to appoint an IMCA. Where there is no duty, there is no general power. And people just, I'm afraid, just don't understand that. Sometimes it's very creative misunderstanding, and IMCAs are appointed in circumstances where actually they probably shouldn't, and I'm sort of not that bothered, but that's, so you did ask.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that one, Darnie?
I don't think so. I know that you probably need to move on, Judith. I just wanted to say spend the time with the family and the person and ensure that information is accessible, because it is worth having that discussion around, very open discussion around the risks equally with alternative nutrition. And sometimes when they hear that and they see the evidence, you are able to reach some sort of consensus with, or some sort of agreement, avoiding all of what Alex has just said.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And that segues beautifully into my next question, which predominantly comes to you, Darnie. I've moved around the questions I think we had pre-planned just because we're answering them as we go along. And it's back to that decision again around, it's interesting what you were saying, Alex, about who GPs belong to, if you like. And so how do we holistically make EDAR decisions and plan for future care when the patient may move between settings and or conditions change?
I found again, I can only speak from experience, but what I found really beneficial was working with the clinical effectiveness team to write a policy, because what that then means is that all the necessary stakeholders get to comment on the content, the processes, the relevant systems, and there's also then the almost endorsement of the training and the regularity of the training and education around the subject, which is included in this entire process. So it is lengthy and time consuming, but hugely beneficial with bringing everyone on board and owning the process. I think that it's sometimes the role of the speech and language therapist in being proactive to explain assessment results and concerns, demonstrating where we add value to the process, to develop a culture of working together for our patients, because it is, after all, a core NHS value. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. And it's about making it, ironically, with all of the work we do, this is around documentation and communication is core, and then everything else hopefully will fall into place. But it's actually having knowledgeable understanding when you start. And I think that's the challenge with how we deliver that, I think. A question really for both of you, and this was sort of answered in your webinar, but I just wondered if you might like to expand on it. And then there are quite a lot of questions in the chat about that, especially around other client groups, for example, like learning disabilities in particular, is how do we ensure, having caveated communication and understanding, how do we ensure that EDAR is not overgeneralized in vulnerable populations? I don't know who would like to take that question. You're nodding, Alex. Oh no, it's back to you, Darnie. Ping pong.
I'm going to go back to my hymn for the evening, which is look at the individual under your care, or look at the individual in front of you. So reflect on what encapsulates person-centered care. I'm thinking about, are we actually thinking about the culture and traditions of this individual that I have a duty of care for? Or am I just looking at the label of learning disability and making assumptions about what might be best for them? I also feel that we shouldn't be afraid to challenge by asking why. Why are they a suitable candidate for eating and drinking with acknowledged risks? And again, that's where I found having a document, if you're having to challenge a medical team member, having a document like a policy is helpful to be able to say, this is how we do things around here. So this is our culture. We need to be able to identify why this person is suitable. And I think it does help avoid the misuse and overgeneralization.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, but just a bit of a mansplain back in legal terms. If you are making assumptions about particular groups, you are very likely to be running straight up against straight into discrimination. We don't do this for people with learning disability. I'm sorry, that's discrimination. So I think, just to reinforce, it's not just the right thing to do from a patient-centric perspective, it is also fundamentally the wrong thing to do to say, we have rules which exclude X, even if they're, the less they're written down, almost the worse they are.
Absolutely, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think segueing, just looking, I realise I'm too old to actually listen and read, but I'm hoping that I've picked up some of the questions in the chat linked back to what you just said, Alex, especially I think the impact of the JJ case especially I think in care homes has been that care homes are really struggling with this. And I just wondered what the messaging for members might be around how we might want to manage that one. I don't know whether, can I go to you first, Alex, and then come back to you, Darren, about your reflections?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this a lot, and I'm going to use a slightly odd analogy, if I may, which is COVID. COVID exposed that organisations which did things well, and exposed that organisations which did things badly, did things very badly. And there's a bit of an analogy here with this, because JJ has exposed people who want to run to risk aversion will now run to risk aversion. People who recognise that's not what this case was saying. It was saying, if you really cannot eliminate all risk, and the team involved conscientiously really do consider they can't stomach it, they can't be forced to it. That is not the message of never take any risk. So I think one of the things is it's a rather hardcore stress test of how true organizations are to the mantra of we're putting the patient first. So I think that's one of the things I want you to be thinking about, and how you come at it is going, it's not just, so yes, it's a decision, but use it as a decision which is a stress test for how much can we think through risk, how much can we mitigate risk, how much can we work with patients, but how much can at the same time we recognise there is a space at some times for some teams to be able, people within teams to go, I can't take this one. And then I think that has to be supported. That's my take, but that's a purely external take.
No, thank you. That's really an interesting and helpful lens. Thank you. Darren, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
I just want to add that there's been such huge organizational learning through this process. And I think it's about working with your respective organizations, care homes, and looking at, I'm just trying to think of the larger perspective of how can we get these teams to listen as well. And it's about governmental targets. Sometimes it's about sequence, the commissioning for quality, local objectives, really working together to see how you can set up a process that works for you as at care home level, organizational level, and getting the documentation right. So I'm going to refer you to NICE Guidance 27, which again, I bring up in all my training sessions, because it is just about the graphic depicts clearly the benefit of information sharing and ensuring that we have this supportive infrastructure for information sharing to, to ensure that our vulnerable clients in care homes are well supported.
Thank you. I am really aware of time. I think that had we got all night, we would keep going with all the gnarly questions coming through the chat. But I am very aware that I'd like to wrap it up for the evening now, if I may. The questions will keep coming. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, we will review all the questions in the chat. We will pull together an FAQ, which will be published on our website in due course. We will also be posting this webinar on our website and on YouTube. And also, if you would, I think there is one more slide. I'm very dutifully being asked to see whether you'd be doing so, whether you would mind all doing some post webinar evaluation very quickly, for which there is a QR code. It says very helpfully scan here on your phone, just so that we can really reflect on how you thought the webinar went, and we will that will really help us in future events. But my final summation, if you like, is really to say not only thank you to our amazing speakers, and I'll come back to you in a minute if I may, but what my take-home message is: this is still very complex. I think the structures and the policies and frameworks that are in place are very helpful. It will always be an individual decision, and I think that is as it should be in this day and age, but that communication and documentation are absolutely key in ensuring that the patient and the clinicians involved get the safest and best outcome. I hope that's something that we can all agree on. It feels very naive in what I'm saying, but I actually think that is the key to what we are doing here. It's making informed decisions made at the best interest of that individual and writing it down and negotiating it, even if you don't personally like it. So with that, I would really like to thank very much to Darren and Alex for your time, for your consideration, your wise words, and your clarity in this ongoingly complex world. No doubt we will be revisiting this again, and thank you very much for your time. I hope everybody has a really good evening, and I'm going to send you off to whichever climate you're in now in your home country. Thank you so much, and good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.